you. So thank you so much to everyone for coming to today's presentation. Special shout out to the people in Public Health 411 who I know Professor Sammy forced into coming. So I really, really appreciate it because, it's lunchtime and y'all could have more, yummy things to be doing. But so we're here today to talk a little bit about the history of the race and ethnicity questions on the census. And as Mr. Hickok said, I'm really here today as a scholar of race and ethnicity whose work has been at the intersection of identity and public relations. So today's presentation is going to have three basic parts. First, I'm going to offer a little overview on identity and identity concepts. Then I'm going to go over the different ways in which race and ethnicity have been examined in the decennial census. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts, personal thoughts, about what this all means for our national identity, and then we'll open it up for questions. So in terms of identity, there are a couple different ways that identity has been defined in the literature. One way that identity is defined, which is not how we're talking about it today, is identity in the sense of personal characteristics. So these are like adjectives, right? Like short, fat, tall, thin, and also preferences, like I'm a snacker, right? That's not really identity in the sense that we're talking about today. It's more about things that I choose that I like. What we're talking about today with respect to identity is identity as defined as reference group orientation. And reference group orientation is about how we see ourselves in reference to or in relation to a particular group. Typical reference groups might be defined by gender, they might be defined by social class, they might be defined by race, they can also be defined by profession or by work affiliation, right? So for example, everyone here, regardless of what other reference group you may adhere to, we're all Titans, right? So go Titans, and that's very different from certain other universities that I won't mention, Bruins. Okay, so cultural identity in the sense of reference group orientation is what Gerd Hofstede said is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one human group from another. There is something about the way that people who identify with the group known as women, there's something about the way that that group is culturally programmed that makes that programming different from the group of people who identify with the cultural group known as men, right? So there's just something about how we identify ourselves that speaks to something fundamental in how we are acculturated or programmed in our minds. So in terms of different aspects of identity, this is again just kind of an identity 101. Scholars talk about identity being avowed versus identity being ascribed. So avowed identities are the identities that we claim for ourselves. We avow it, right? So in my own personal example, I avow an identity of being Chinese American, which means that I see a connection between myself and that reference group called Americans, as well as a connection between myself and that reference group called Chinese, okay? I also happen to avow a very strong Texas identity because I grew up in Houston, and you can tell that I have modified my accent to be understood in California, but when necessary, I can draw with the best of them. I mean, y'all would just not believe. But so in terms of my avowal of a Texas identity, that is not necessarily something that might be obvious to someone if I'm just walking on campus, okay? So here we get to the distinction between identity that is avowed or claimed by yourself versus identity that is ascribed, which is the identity that is assigned to you by someone else. Identity ascriptions typically and unsurprisingly are based on really superficial characteristics, right? So if I'm walking on campus and I'm wearing a dress, someone might ascribe to me a female identity. If I'm walking on campus and I'm speaking to somebody in Chinese, someone overhearing us might ascribe to me a Chinese identity. It's highly unlikely, unless they see me talking on campus and saying y'all, it's highly unlikely that somebody just walking by me on campus would ascribe to me a Texas identity, even though that really is an identity that I avow very strongly. So don't mess with Texas. Y'all have heard this. Okay. So the other part of identity that I think is really important to talk about is identity is multifaceted. And what that means is that all of us have, at any given moment, a whole bunch of different reference groups to which we feel a sense of attachment, right? So we are all family members, we are all Titans, we all belong to different racial groups, gender groups, etc. We see this play out in the college campus because for those of us who are old enough to remember, there was a time when professors didn't care about any of their students' identities except for the student identity, right? Back in the day, all we cared about was that kid was in my class and they better show up every day and they had to take notes and listen when I was talking. Today, fortunately, most college professors have come a long way to acknowledge that our students have multifaceted identities. Not only are they students in our class, but they are also someone's daughter. They might be someone's parent. They might be someone's sibling. And faculty, I think, now are a lot more attuned to the multifaceted nature of our students' identities and therefore much more willing to take that into consideration, right? As opposed to saying, well, you missed class, you're not going to get credit for that assignment, when really maybe they missed class because their child had to go to the ER and that's where they were because that's where they needed to be in that moment. So that's the multifaceted nature of identity. What's interesting here is to look at the work that Crenshaw had done in terms of intersectionality and how all of our different identities intersect at different points in time, which gets us to the third most important characteristic about identity, which is that identity is situational in terms of what different parts of us might be salient or relevant at any given moment in time, right? So, for example, the fact that I happen to have a job on this campus as a dean is really not at all a salient part of my identity. The students who are here today aren't even actually from my college because, as a dean, I can't force my own students to come. So really, situational nature of identity means that in any given situation, at any given moment, one or more parts of our identity are more relevant than other parts. And so the question then is always kind of figuring out at any particular moment in time, which identity is the most salient in terms of that particular situation. Okay, are there any questions so far? All right, so now let's extrapolate from personal identity to national identity. So national identity, just like individual identities, can at once be avowed, identities that we claim for ourselves as a country, as well as ascribed, right? Identities that are assigned to us by other people. A great example of this, actually, in terms of US identity, is Americans like to see ourselves as global peacekeepers, right? We send people all over and we kind of maintain the peace. It sometimes comes as a surprise to some Americans that there are parts of the world where we're not really seen as peacekeepers. We're actually seen as people who kind of instigate different controversies to our own benefit, right? So that's the difference between the identity that we avow or that we claim for ourselves as a country versus the identities that other people assign to us based on their own experience. So national identity, whether it's American nation or other countries, is often reflected in public opinion surveys as well as population studies for that country. National identity is also often reflected in media reports. This could be news reports, but also media representations, right? So in terms of how different national groups are portrayed, not only in news media, but also in entertainment media, okay? We also have national identity as it is expressed by national leadership and public figures. This could be elected leaders who hold a particular office, but this could also just be public figures, right? Like famous movie stars or singers, etc. We also have national identity in terms of it being shaped, if you will, by different public policies and by government legislation in terms of identifying who can belong to the nation and who does not belong in the nation. And then finally, the topic of our conversation today, our national identity is also shaped in many ways by the decennial census. And actually, interestingly enough, the slogan for the 2020 census is actually Shape Your Future. And I think that that speaks very much to how the results of the census shape our sense of national identity and shape our sense of who we are. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the census. And I'd like to give a shout out to Jennifer Lee, who is here today. Jennifer, raise your hand, who is the partnership specialist for the Census 2020 effort in Orange County. And so she's here to help me answer all the really detailed census questions in case any come up. So in terms of general background on the census, you all know that the census is a count, right? It's a basic enumeration of everybody living in the United States and our territories. It might come as a surprise to some that our country has territories. Regardless of why people are here, regardless of their immigration status, they're supposed to be enumerated as of Census Day, which is April 1. April 1 is not a deadline. It's just the as of date for doing the count, okay? We also do special enumerations for Americans who live abroad. This could be people who work at U.S. embassies, Americans who work at U.S. embassies. There's also a whole special effort to count military who are deployed overseas, right? So basically, we're trying to get a count for everybody that is part of the national identity America. The census is actually mandated by the U.S. Constitution, and the first census was conducted in 1790. And if you go back and look at the census, you see that our interest in getting a count of race and ethnicity goes all the way back to the very first census. So even in the 1790 census, there was a question about race. As mandated by the Constitution, the census is done every 10 years, which is why it's called the decennial census. And for 2010, it was relatively easy for most households. It was only about 10 questions, and it took about 10 minutes to complete. So that's kind of the basic, really quick background on the census. In terms of the race and ethnicity question on the census, what we see is that the way in which the government has tried to collect data about race and ethnicity has always changed over time. And in many ways, those changes reflect our societal concerns as well as social changes, political changes, and economic changes. These have included emancipation, immigration, civil rights. Basically, if you look at the race and ethnicity categories on the census historically, taking a longitudinal view, all of that is really revealing for things that our country may have been going through at any given point in time. And that, I think, speaks to what I mentioned earlier, being the situational nature of identity, right? We have always been concerned with, some might say preoccupied with, this question of race and the different racial groups. But the specific racial groups that we tried to collect information on really reflected historical situations of the given moment. The census also collects not just race data, but gender data, household data. All of that speaks to the multifaceted nature of identity, specifically how different identities intersect. So not only with respect to race and ethnicity, but all the other demographic variables that the census collects. And finally, the census really, I think, reflects this notion of claiming identities versus having identities be assigned to you, specifically with regard to the race and ethnicity question, and that's what I'll be going into next. So this is a copy from a book that I got when I worked at the Census Bureau of the 1790 census form. And what's interesting about that very first census that was conducted in 1790 is there was actually no uniform printed form. Different marshals for the census in different parts of the country collected whatever information in a prescribed way. So there were specific pieces of information that they had to get. There was no designated format for how that information would be collected, how that information would be rendered, okay? They were supposed to get a list of stuff plus other information that the marshals personally deemed to be relevant. Okay, so in the 1790 census, as well as in the 1800 census and in the 1810 census, the racial categories that the census takers, the marshals, had to choose from really reflected what was in Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And there were basically three categories. The categories were slaves, free white females and males, and all other free persons. Okay, so those were the three categories in the first three censuses. And so this is a copy of the census form from 1810 where you can't really see because it's blurry, but on the top there I've circled for you free versus slave. And that was obviously something that the census takers were instructed to collect because the government cared about that. Now, what was interesting is that in the 1820 census, a new category was included. So on top of slave, free white, and then other free persons, a new category for free colored persons was added to the census in 1820. And this really reflects two things. It reflects that free blacks and free whites had different rights. They were counted differently. But also it reflected that there was an increase, numerical increase, in the numbers of African Americans who were free. And so the government felt strongly that that information had to be gathered. Okay, so that was a new category in 1820. In 1860, as you know, we're like leading up into the Civil War here. In the 1860 census form, which in some ways duplicated the 1850 form. So let me back up. In the 1850 census form, a new category was introduced for the first time that actually, the way the Census Bureau talks about it is it was measuring a quote unquote black blood quantum. And the term that was used in the 1850 census was mulatto. So we're coming from a situation where we used to only look at slaves, free whites, and then other free people. Then in 1820, we had slaves, free blacks. Now, all of a sudden, in the 1850 census, the term mulatto was on the census form, and that was to be used for both free inhabitants and slave inhabitants. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting change. In the 1860 census, so now moving from 1850 to 1860, the 1860 census also had the term mulatto. Also in the 1860 census, census takers were instructed to only enumerate American Indians, indigenous Americans, who were taxed, who paid federal tax. So taxed American Indians were those who had renounced tribal rule and they exercised the rights of citizens under state or territorial laws as opposed to tribal laws. And this primarily included American Indians who had settled in or near white communities and who had assimilated, quote unquote, into American society. So another interesting thing, the third interesting thing about the 1860 census is that California had a different form. California was the only state in that census for 1860 where there was an extra racial category for Chinese, clearly reflecting the Chinese population that was in the state of California, but maybe not so much in other parts of the country, so the other states didn't care, and we had our own special form. Okay, 1870. So in the 1870 census form, the part that I've circled reads white, black, mulatto, Chinese, or Indian, by which they meant American Indian. And this was now becoming a little bit more prevalent. And what's interesting here is that Chinese, which in the 1860 census was only on the form as used in California, by 1870 and also subsequently in 1880, that term was on all the census forms nationwide. And so it reflects, I think, kind of the migration of that population across the country from California. The other interesting thing about the term Chinese when it was added to the census form is that that was actually the very first use of a national origin category. Previous to the inclusion of the term Chinese, there wasn't any other country referred to, okay? So I'm going to take a minute here to read you the actual directions that were given to the census takers in 1870. Because remember, back in the day, the census was done by marshals or other enumerators who literally came to your house and counted the people in your house at your door, okay? So the census takers in 1870, this was their instruction for that column that's circled. The label of that column is color. Here are the instructions. It must not be assumed that where nothing is written in this column, white is to be understood. This column must always be filled. Be particularly careful in reporting the class mulatto. The word here is generic and includes quadroons, octoroons, and all persons having any perceptible trace of African blood. Important scientific results depend upon the correct determination of this class in Schedules 1 and 2. So that was verbatim the instructions to the census takers on the 1870 census form. Moving on to the 1890 census form, what we see here is that the government in 1890 decides to get away from the generic term mulatto, and they actually want to see the actual percentages of people's heritage. So what the form says right here, the choices on the form are white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, or Indian. And so you see how now it's not enough to just know if somebody is mixed race. They want to know like exactly what percent mixed you are, at least with respect to African heritage. The 1890 census also is the first attempt that our government had to enumerate all American Indians, I'm using the census term, to enumerate all American Indians regardless of where they lived. However, what's interesting is that the American Indians who were not taxed were excluded from the population count for apportionment, right? So census results are used to divide up seats in the House of Representatives, and in the 1890 census, specific instructions were given to enumerators to make a distinction between American Indians who paid taxes and American Indians who didn't pay taxes, and the ones who didn't pay taxes were excluded from the apportionment counts, okay? Also interesting here is that Japanese is called out for the very first time on a census form, and that demonstrates the increased migration to the U.S. Of immigrants from Japan. So let me skip ahead a couple decades because even though we're going over 200 years of census race history, you don't want this presentation to take 200 years. Okay, so let's talk about the 1930 census form. So I'm actually going to take some time to read you again the very specific instructions that enumerators were given. So remember, these are the people coming to your house to enumerate your household, and these were the instructions that they got to report race. If someone is mixed white and Negro, they are to be returned as Negro no matter the percentage of Negro blood. Part Indian and part Negro also should be listed as Negro unless the Indian blood predominated and the person was generally accepted as Indian in the community. I have to keep doing air quotes because I just can't believe this language, but it is what it was. Someone who was of mixed Indian and white heritage should be returned as Indian, except where the percentage of Indian blood was very small or where he or she was regarded as white in the community. Someone who was of non-white race should be listed as non-white if they were mixed with, Someone who was of mixed white and non-white races should be listed as non-white, Okay, so if you're even in the slightest bit tainted, you should be listed as non-white. If someone is mixed of 2 or more non-white races, then the race of the father was listed. Of particular interest, perhaps, to those of us in California, the 1930 census was the first time that the term Mexican was used on a census form. So Mexican was added to the form, and this term was to be used for anyone born in Mexico or with parents born in Mexico who was definitely not white, Negro, Indian, Japanese, or Chinese. Okay, so that's the 1930 census. Mexican, the term, appears for the very first time, but then 10 years later, in the 1940 census, the instruction to the enumerator was, if someone says they're Mexican, put them down as white, unless they are definitely Indian or some other race than white. All right, 1950 census form, Filipino was added. I'm working really hard to not editorialize. 1960 census form, okay, 1960 census form. So in the 1960 census form, there's a couple things that I would point out. You can't read that, but these were the instructions to enumerators. If someone says they're Puerto Rican, Mexican, or any other person of Latin descent, you need to classify them as white unless they are definitely Negro, Indian, or some other race. Southern European and Near Eastern nationalities should also be written in as white. Asian Indians were to be input as other with a handwritten of Hindu. Even if you happen to be Asian Indian but weren't Hindu, you were going to be labeled as Hindu. A little side note, Hindu in the 1960 census form was the first and only time a religion has been included in the race question, and it was subsequently dropped. The other thing that's interesting about the 1960 census form is the categories were listed on the form as white, Negro, American Indian, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Hawaiian, part Hawaiian, Aleut, and Eskimo, etc. And note, of course, that Hawaiian and Alaskan were probably added to the 1960 form because Alaska and Hawaii were admitted to statehood in 1959. Okay, 1970. So the 1970 census form is where now all of a sudden we have a whole separate question. So all this time since 1790, the question has been color or has been race or whatever. The 1970 census form is the first time that now all of a sudden we're going to separate out race from this new question. And the new question in 1970 was termed Spanish origin or descent. And so that's where we start to see now a bifurcation in terms of what is supposedly a race or what is supposedly an ethnicity. Also here in the 1970 census form, Korean was added to a very long list. Two things that I would mention in addition to the 1970 census form. The first one is this. Up until the 1970 census, as I mentioned, the census was done by people going to your house, basically looking at you and saying, you look like whatever, or that's what I'm going to put on the form, okay? No matter what you tell me, that's what I'm putting on the form. The 1970 census was the very first time that the Census Bureau went to a full census by U.S. Postal Service. So really, it was the first time that people had the opportunity to fill out the form themselves in the privacy of their own homes and mail it back to the government, okay? So this, in terms of identity, the 1970 census was really the first time that people had the opportunity to avow for themselves the identity that they wanted to claim. However, if you didn't do that, if a census taker ended up having to come to your house, there were detailed instructions, again, given to enumerators about how people should be classified, okay? So here's the list of people who were instructed to be instructed. Here's a list of people for whom the enumerators were instructed to reclassify as white, okay? If you said you were Chicano, they reclassified you as white. If you said La Raza or Mexican American, they reclassified you as white. If you said you were a Muslim, they reclassified you as white, okay? So even though the 1970 census, which really isn't that long ago, even though the 1970 census was the first time that people had a chance to really avow their own identities, that didn't prevent the government from ascribing an identity to you based on what they thought your identity should be. All right, 1980. So 2 important things about the 1980 census is enumerators were specifically instructed you are no longer allowed to enter race by observation. And that is a huge win for all of us because for the first time ever, you could say what you were, and then that's how that information would be received, as opposed to somebody deciding that even though you said you were one thing, they were gonna stick you in another category. So enumerators were no longer allowed to enter race by observation. What's also interesting in the 1980 census is that if somebody was of mixed race descent, the mother's race is the one that was reported. And that's very different from just 50 years ago in 1930, if you remember. If someone was mixed race, the race of the father was recorded. Okay, so we see a little bit of a shift there. Okay, 1990 census. So the 1990 census grew out the Asian Pacific Islander group with additions like Cambodian, Tongan, Laotian, Hmong, Thai, Pakistani, et cetera. And this is a reflection, most likely, of the immigration patterns that our country saw in the 80s. And then in 2000, and this was the census that I got to work on, a couple things that I would point out about the 2000 census form. The first one is that this was the very first time ever in the history of our country that people were allowed to pick more than one racial category. Okay, so multi-race response, it was huge. It was a big deal for my family because my kids are multiracial, right? So you could actually check off more than one category, and that was really, really important to a lot of people. The other thing about the 2000 census was that the term Latino was used for the very first time on the government document, and so that's when we first see the appearance of that particular terminology. Now remember, the 2000 census form, like the one in 1970, still had a race question and an ethnicity question. And what's interesting about the 2000 census form, because people could pick more than one race, some other race in the racial category was actually the 3rd largest race group. So in 2000 and in 2010, some other race was the 3rd largest race group, and the Census Bureau's analysis suggests that it's because most of the people who checked off some other race had also checked off yes to the "Are you of Hispanic, Latino descent?" question, and those people felt that they really weren't any race because they were Hispanic, okay? So, which brings us to the present day. The 2010 census used the same categories. Multi-race identification was encouraged. Now we get to the 2020 census. So a couple interesting things about the 2020 census. First of all, the same basic categories are used as in 2010 and in 2000. These categories are actually based on guidelines that were established by the Federal Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. The OMB race guidelines were most recently updated in 1997, so like a quarter century ago. Wait, am I doing my math right? Yeah, so like a quarter century ago. And they could stand to use some more updating. The 2020 census is asking for more details for some people. So if you are identifying as white or African American or American Indian, they want to know a little bit more specific. Like white, okay, like do you know what your country of origin was? If you're Black, what country of origin are you from? So they're trying to get a little bit more detailed, even though the actual categories that you can pick from are the same, okay? So the other interesting that happened for the 2020 census was this. In 2017, the Census Bureau made a recommendation to the Office of Management and Budget for 2 changes. The first change was, let's get rid of the ethnicity question. I mean, data from 2000 and 2010 show most people saying yes to Hispanic descent see that as their race, so let's just get rid of that category and make Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin an actual option in the race category, okay? So that was one recommendation from the Bureau. And I have to tell you, having worked at the Census Bureau does not do anything willy-nilly or lightly. All of this is based on a bajillion different studies that the Bureau has done, right? The other recommendation that they made was to create a new category, which the Bureau recommended to be MENA, for Middle East and North African. So these were the recommendations that the Census Bureau made to the Office of Management and Budget in 2017. And what happened was the Office of Management and Budget failed to respond by the deadline. The deadline was December 31st, 2017. They did not respond to the deadlines, and therefore the Census Bureau was forced to retain the present racial categories. Counting the population is a really difficult endeavor. It's not like all of a sudden one day you can decide to change a question and the next day, poof, different forms appear, right? It takes 12 years to plan a census, 4 years to evaluate a census. So the fact that the OMB missed the deadline in 2017 is significant because the Bureau had to gear up for the 2020 census, and these recommendations were not able to be implemented, even though the Census Bureau's own research suggested that these would have yielded a much better count, okay? All right, so that's the background on the census. Now let me just take a breath. So what does this all say about our country? So I think if you get back to this idea of identity being avowed or asserted, whether for an individual or for a country, I think the census data are really showing that our country is kind of confused, to put it mildly. We have conflicting claims about who we are as a country, right? So, for example, we claim to be a representative democracy, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, and I'll just not comment on the men part. That's what we say, but we're also saying that that representative democracy as an ideal was not always achieved, right? So going all the way back to the 1790 census, remember the categories were slave, free white, and other free people. If you were in the slave category, for census apportionment purposes, you counted as 3/5 of a person. In no math class on earth does 3/5 equal 5/5. So not all men are created equal, despite what we are claiming, okay? We also claim to be a nation of immigrants, by which we mean a nation of voluntary immigrants. And again, that kind of contradicts what we are trying to get at with our census by having the category of slave versus free, because the people who came to this country who were slaves didn't really immigrate voluntarily, right? So we talk about being a nation of immigrants, voluntary immigrants, and that discourse leaves out the reality that a lot of people here are descendants of people who came to this country involuntarily. It also ignores, I think, the very real situation that the people who were here before so many of us were systematically erased from our national identity through different kinds of government policies and laws. Okay, so we also like to think of ourselves as being a multicultural, diverse society. But yet, until recent years, the primary racial group, the predominant racial group in the country has been white, right? And that's not because America has always been a white country, right? It's because of how we have chosen to count people, but it's also because of different laws and policies that our government put in place, right? Like Chinese people, after a certain while, like 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, literally we couldn't come here, right? And so that's how the whiteness, if you will, of the nation was maintained for a really long time, was through certain immigration laws that kept things that way. Okay, so basically, what does the census tell us about the identity of our country? What we see here through this short walk through history is that the labels that we have used in our national conversation about race, pretty much all of those labels have shifted over time. They have been adjusted in many different ways. What is the only racial category from 1790 to the present that has not been changed? White. So the only category in 200 plus years of the census that has never changed is the category of white. Now, what went into that category may have differed over time, but as a label, that label has not changed, whereas all these other labels have kind of changed and adapted over time, okay? So I think I would just conclude with a maybe more optimistic note that our best days are yet to come, because our country has not lived up, I think, to either the idea or the ideal of what it really means to be America. And I think the person who best encapsulated this was Langston Hughes in his poem, Let America Be America Again, right? Like what we want to be and what we aspire to be is so amazing, and we can still get there, but we're not there yet. So with that, I know some of y'all probably have 1 o'clock class, so feel free to dash out if you need to go. And then I guess I'll take questions.
Oh, yeah.